there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 8, and just a little catch up on what's been going on. In the last issue, we actually finished the first big story arc of Swamp Thing, and in that, Swamp Thing went to Gotham. We saw Batman trying to track Swamp Thing down, and Swamp Thing trying to figure out who the leader of the Conclave was. And that man was actually a man that works for Bruce Wayne named Nathan Ellergy. So after going through Gotham's underworld, Swamp Thing is able to find out where Nathan Ellergy lives. He goes there and finds a big party in Nathan Ellergy's penthouse apartment. Batman also follows Swamp Thing there, and they have a big confrontation where they fight. And then Swamp Thing is able to finally confront Nathan. Nathan shoots Swamp Thing's dog because he's mad at it. And of course, this angers Swamp Thing, so he begins delivering hard justice with his fists to Nathan. But before he goes too far, Swamp Thing has a change of heart, and he lets Nathan go, but Nathan trips and falls over the edge of his balcony. And that is how the leader of the Conclave died. And that is where we left off on the last issue. So first things first, with issue 8, we see Swamp Thing in some sort of cave. It looks like maybe a mine, because there's some mining equipment in the background, and then we see some tentacles coming up, about to grab him. And we see that this issue is written by Len Wein with art by Bernie Wrightson. And as we turn to the first page, we get some narration. We see Swamp Thing is walking in the snow, and the narration says, "For your information, the freeze point of water is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and when the temperature falls below this point, the rain becomes snow. The freezing point of your average plant is not terribly different from that of rain, and when this point is reached, said plant's metabolic rate decreases sharply, slowing almost to a crawl, all of which should help explain the terrible sluggishness felt by a certain mossy man-brute as he shambles through the snow-swept Appalachian wood." And we see the name of this issue is The Lurker in Tunnel 13. So as Swamp Thing walks, he's thinking, "Me and my bright ideas, getting so cold I can hardly move. If I don't find shelter soon, I've had it." Then we get a flashback of how he got out of Gotham, and we see him sneaking into the back of a semi-truck, and the narration says, "If there had only been another way out of Gotham City, but with the Batman hot on my trail, I didn't exactly have time to choose my mode of travel. Didn't even have the courage enough to stay with the truck once we were out of town. First stop the driver made, I got off, and now I'm lost in the middle of..." And then Swamp Thing's thoughts are cut off by a scream that happens in a cave nearby. And Swamp Thing thinks, "What? A scream coming from somewhere near. It's coming from that cave. The storm's so thick I didn't even see it. Never would have either if that scream hadn't attracted my attention. Whoever is in there needs help, and I'm going to find out why." So Swamp Thing walks over to the cave, and the second he peeks his head in, he sees what was making that screaming sound, and what he sees is an old man on the ground, and there is a giant brown bear standing over top of him. And when Swamp Thing sees this, he thinks, "Good God, a little old man and the biggest bear I've ever seen. The poor guy must have stumbled into his den by accident and disturbed the grizzly's sleep." Then the bear turns from the man who's on the ground to Swamp Thing, who has also just walked in and surprised it. And Swamp Thing thinks, "Uh-oh, appears Mr. Bear doesn't want company of any kind. Well, at least I took his attention off the old timer." So the bear rushes at Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing actually uses his momentum to grab the bear's arm and flip it. And this is great because there's a little sound effect that the bear has over his head that says, "Huh?" As if the bear is asking, "What the heck?" And as Swamp Thing flips the bear over, he thinks, "And friend Bear will soon learn I am a trifle harder to handle than your average old man." So I guess Swamp Thing thinks the bear is out for the count, and he goes over to the old man to check on him. And the man was talking earlier when Swamp Thing first entered the cave. He was saying, "Help, please, my chest, the pain." And as Swamp Thing goes over to him now, the old man says, "Please, please help me." And Swamp Thing thinks, "Lord, this man is torn up badly. Take it easy, old timer. I'll do what I..." But his thoughts are cut off because the bear, in fact, was not passed out or anything. And so the bear comes back and takes a swipe at Swamp Thing, knocking him backwards. And then as Swamp Thing stands up to fight, the bear rakes across Swamp Thing's chest with its claws, causing Swamp Thing to bleed out green. And Swamp Thing thinks, "Ugh, looks like all I did was make the grizzly angry. If I was human, That swipe would have torn me wide open. And instead of fighting back, Swamp Thing is trying to be nice to the bear, so he's just pushing him away a little bit, and Swamp Thing thinks, come on, bear, back off. Go back to sleep. Don't force me to hurt you. But the bear does its finishing move, which is a bear hug. So it gives Swamp Thing a big ol' hug, and it begins to crush him, and Swamp Thing thinks, ugh, who was I kidding? Me hurt him? He has me in a bear hug. That will break my back if I don't get loose, and quickly. So as the bear is hugging him harder and harder, Swamp Thing begins to push up on the bear's chin, and it's kind of forcing the bear's head upwards and back. And the bear definitely doesn't like this, and Swamp Thing thinks, but I will get loose if only I can gain some leverage. Got it. Now I have to push. And that is what he does, and he pushes until the bear's neck snaps, and you hear a big crack, and the bear falls to the ground with Swamp Thing. And the narration says, for the briefest instant, the shaggy behemoth totters on its feet, its tiny eyes slowly glazing over. Then, like a poleaxe tree, it falls. And as Swamp Thing rolls out from underneath it, he thinks, hated to snap its neck like that, but it gave me no choice. I have to get this carcass off me and see about the old man. So Swamp Thing gets up and approaches the old man, and the narration says, but the old man's blood-rimmed eyes are too far gone to see in turn the moss-encrusted monstrosity that kneels at his side mere moments later. And this is important just so the man doesn't realize that Swamp Thing is a monster. He thinks he's a regular human. So because he can't see Swamp Thing, he's just treating him normal, and he begins to talk to him saying, thank you, stranger, for what you did for me, but it's too late to help me now. All I can give you to repay you for your kindness is a warning. If you're a stranger in these parts, stay a stranger. Whatever you do, don't go to Perdition. Don't go into town. Then as the old man speaks, we get some flashback panels that show us the memories of the town he's warning Swamp Thing of. And the old man continues, not that Perdition wasn't a good town once. It was a fine town, a mining town, rich in coal and precious ores. But then the coal ran out, and the people started running out as well. There wasn't any natural way to restore the mines, so my pappy, he started checking into unnatural ways, the occult and the supernatural. So in the panels, we're seeing the town flourishing, then we're seeing people leaving the town, then we're seeing the old man's dad reading some ancient occultic tomes. And the narration continues, then one night, I guess he thought he was ready. He gathered up all the mystic books and such he'd been collecting and carried them into the mine, and that was the last time anyone ever saw of my pappy. Oh, there was a scream that night, of course. Came rolling out of the mine, spilling across the streets of the town, but never any sign of the man who made the horrid sound. And just like the narration said, we see the dad collecting all his books, and there's a couple skeletons and stuff in the room too, so I don't know if that's where he found the books or if he's been doing human sacrifices. Then we get a panel of everybody in the town looking out of their window at night as they hear a horrific scream coming from the mines. And the narration continues. Things haven't been the same in Perdition since then. The strange disappearance of anybody going too close to the mines, the gnawing fear that everybody lives there with, and the fact that since my pappy vanished, no one else has ever left town. Then under this narration, we see there's a panel where someone is walking too close to the entrance of a mine, and they are getting pulled in by tentacles. Then we cut to the present, and we are back in the cave with Swamp Thing looking at the old man, and the old man is finishing his story saying, until me, that is. I was leaving town. I was running from it when I met up with that bear. Now I guess they'll never get me back there again. And as Swamp Thing cradles the old man's body, Swamp Thing thinks, old man, he's gone. And as we turn the page, we see Swamp Thing is carrying the old man's body through the woods that are all snow-covered, and it's snowing pretty hard while he's walking. And the narration says, the falling snow is cold, colder perhaps than it was a short while before. But a solemn Swamp Thing no longer seems to feel the cold as he carries a frail limp burden seemingly endlessly through the ivory-frosted woods. So as Swamp Thing carries the man, he's thinking, I couldn't just leave the old man in the cave. He should have a proper burial. His family should be notified if he has one. Still, I can't carry him forever. Have to find somewhere to take him. Decide some destination before I can. Then almost as if the earth was listening to Swamp Thing, he walks out of a clearing in the forest and all of a sudden he's on a rocky ledge overlooking a town. And he thinks, good Lord, it seems my decision has been made for me. Unless I miss my guess, by a long shot, this is the town of Perdition. I've carried the old man home. Then we cut to inside the town as Swamp Thing is just entering with the old man's body, and the narration says, but as the moss-encrusted man-brute shambles along the decrepit town's main street. And we see some people come out and see Swamp Thing, and they begin pointing at him and shouting, and they all have some sort of mining equipment in their hands, like they could use them for weapons. And the shouting men are saying, oh my lord, Hector, look! It's some sort of monster, and he's killed old Ezekiel. And then Ezekiel runs forward towards Swamp Thing saying, monster, huh? Well, we'll show it no blame monster can kill one of our own people and get away with it. And as Swamp Thing lays down the old man's body in the snow, Swamp Thing sees the men running at him and he thinks, oh no, not another mindless mob. And almost as if it's like routine now, he just stands up and he starts hitting the people away. He's like backhanding them and smacking them, not hurting them too bad. And he's thinking while he's doing this, wherever I go, I'm attacked by weapon-wielding cretins. And to tell the honest truth, I'm sick and tired of it. So there are a total of 3 men attacking. One of them is batted away instantly. That is the man that ran forward first, Hector. Then the one who pointed out Swamp Thing to everybody, he gets picked up and thrown by Swamp Thing. But there's one more man and he has a pickaxe. And as Swamp Thing is picking up and throwing the first man, this pickaxe man takes a swing and hits Swamp Thing right in the gut. But of course, it doesn't do anything. And the man exclaims, Lordy, it ain't possible. And then I guess that man just falls down in the snow in disbelief because he's on the ground in the next panel, but we don't see Swamp Thing hit him or anything. Then as Swamp Thing removes the pickaxe from his torso, Hector yells out, nobody does that to Hector. Do you hear me? Nobody. So you go on and stand there, monster, because when me and the boys get finished with you, you ain't never going to be able to stand a get. But Hector's threats are cut off by another man off panel saying, all right, that'll be just enough of this madness. And then one of Hector's boys turns to see who spoke and he says, hold it, Hector, folks is coming. Then as Swamp Thing looks up, he sees a big group of people from the town approach, and Swamp Thing thinks, no longer coming, little man. They're here. But have they come to give me more trouble? So Swamp Thing begins to kind of flex and prepare for a fight just in case. But as the group approaches, we see an old balding man who kind of looks like Doc Brown from Back to the Future. Then we see a small family standing next to him, and the old man says, Jason, look, a stranger. What's someone from the outside world doing here? And Jason, who is the father of the family, he replies, I don't know, Mayor Muttridge, but I intend to find out. So I'll describe Jason and his family here. We see Jason is in a red billowy shirt with brown pants, and he's a very muscly white guy with very, very red hair. And his wife next to him is wearing a green dress, and she is also white and has flowing blonde hair. And their son next to them looks like a mini version of him, except he has reddish brown hair. And he looks up at Swamp Thing and says, gee, Ma, he's a biggin', isn't he? Then the townspeople look down and they see the body of the old man that Swamp Thing brought back to the town. And Hector points to it and says, doing here? I'll tell you what he's doing here, Jason. He's committing murder. Go on and look for yourself. That monster killed your pappy. And as Jason looks down at the old man on the ground, he says, my father? No, he couldn't have. And then he kneels down to check on the body. And after he examines it, he looks up and he says, murder, you say? Then check the body. My father wasn't killed by the stranger. He was clawed to death by a bear. Then Hector kneels down and looks at the body and says, why, yes, he was. He was indeed. By George! Then Jason tries to talk some understanding to Hector as he points to Swamp Thing and says, "You see? The stranger's innocent. You attacked him for no reason. Come on now, Hector. Admit your mistake. Tell the stranger you didn't mean to call him a monster." So Hector stands up sheepishly and he walks over to Swamp Thing and he says, "Ah, shucks, stranger. I'm downright sorry if I offended you." Then everybody just kind of stares at Swamp Thing and marvels at him, and Jason's son even comes up and starts to rub on Swamp Thing's chest, I guess just to make sure he's real. And as he does this, Swamp Thing looks down at the boy and he thinks, "What kind of town is this? They're all crazier than." But his thoughts are cut off by the boy saying, "Oh ma, look! The bear clawed the stranger too! He's hurt!" And Jason behind him replies, "So he is. How terrible. You'd better come with us, stranger, and let Lydia tend to those cuts." So Jason picks up his father from the ground and then begins to walk back into the town. And Swamp Thing takes him up on his offer and he walks behind Jason as he thinks, "With pleasure. Crazy or not, that's the first invitation I've received in a long time." Then we cut to a very ominous panel that is the last panel on the page, so we're going to turn and see hopefully what this is. But we can't really tell. We just see like a bundle of musculature and flesh, and the narration over it says, "He awakens." But as we turn the page, we do not get to see what that was, because we cut to inside one of the houses as Lydia, the wife of Jason, is washing the chest of Swamp Thing with a damp sponge. And it's not just Lydia and her family in this house. It is everybody that was outside is now inside the house, and they're just kind of hanging around Swamp Thing as Lydia is tending to him. And one of them is Hector, and Hector says, "There you go, pal. Lydia's not hurting you none now, is she?" And another man says, "Good. Now just rest easy and everything's going to be fine." Then we see the mayor cut in and he says, Yes, mighty fine, indeed. You'll be good as new, first-class shape." Then he walks over to Swamp Thing and he says, "After all, we wouldn't want to lose the first visitor this town's had in years now, would we?" And then we get this really weird panel of Jason coming over, and Swamp Thing is in like a lazy boy chair. And he stands in front of Swamp Thing, so he must be like straddling Swamp Thing's legs because Swamp Thing's legs are up on an ottoman. And then he leans forward and puts his hands on top of the armrest that Swamp Thing has his arms on. So he's literally like 8 inches from Swamp Thing's face, and he's looking down on Swamp Thing, and he says, "The mayor's right, friend. You just relax and recuperate. We all want you back in perfect condition. Absolutely perfect condition." And Swamp Thing is eating this up. When the mayor was talking to him, he had a big smile on his face. Now Jason's talking to him and he seems to be laughing along. And he's not picking up on the fact that everybody's being a little too nice, if you know what I mean. So right as Jason does that super fake laugh, we get another creepy panel of that musculature and flesh, and it begins to stir. And we see in the center of that mass, an eyeball opens up. And the narration says, "And awakening, he becomes aware." Then we cut back again from that creepy panel back to the room where everybody is laughing now and they're holding their stomachs, they're laughing so hard. And this makes Swamp Thing suspicious finally. So we get a panel of Swamp Thing looking very suspicious at them as they all continue to laugh, and the narration says, "Everyone laughs heartily at Jason's little jest. Everyone save the Swamp Thing, that is. For he sees no humor in Jason's simple comment, and the fact that they all do sends shivers up his misshapen spine. The laughter fades quickly, but the air of merriment does not. The convivial chatter drones on." So as this party continues, we get a panel of everybody talking, and Swamp Thing is just standing there now. He's not laughing. He doesn't look like he's having much fun, but all the humans are talking and laughing. And in the background, we see the son of Jason all of a sudden perk up, and it almost looks as if he's in a trance. And as the party continues, we see him walk out of the room. And then he proceeds to walk out the front door. And the narration over these panels says, "The banal banter that is the lifeblood of any party fills the room. And as is also true of the average party, nobody notices the silent, stiff-limbed departure of one of its smaller guests. Nobody notices anything, in fact. For though the mundane conversation has not flagged, everyone seems somehow distracted now, as if some mutually unpleasant thought has taken nest in the back of their minds." And although the bewildered man-monster senses the uneasiness that gnaws at the gathered throng, they do their best to conceal it, until it can be hidden no longer. Then all of a sudden, there's a loud shriek through the party, and Jason turns because he knows that scream, and he says, "Lydia? Good Lord, woman, what is it?" And Lydia answers, "Jason, it's Jody. Our son is gone." And as Jason goes over to comfort her, he hugs her and says, "Gone? What do you mean gone? He has to be someplace." And Lydia replies, "But he's not, Jason. I checked the entire house. Oh God, Jason, our child is wandering lost outside." And then the mayor cuts in saying, "If he is, Lydia, we'll find him. We'll organize a search party. That's what we'll do, a search party." Then another of the men yells out, "You bet we will." And Hector joins in with that man saying, "Come on, let's get moving." Then we get another of those creepy panels where we get an extreme close-up on an eyeball, and the pupil is pinkish red, and there's like a shine on it, and it definitely looks like its brow is furrowed, so it looks angry, and the narration over this panel says, "And coming aware, he has called." So all the people get in a big search party, and they go outside with torches, and Swamp Thing just follows them, I guess. And as they're walking through the woods, the narration says, "The snow has stopped falling now, and it lies upon the landscape like a shroud of scattered dreams. Dreams now broken, even as the snowy crust is broken, by the track of two small sneakered feet." And we see Jason in the front of this group, and he's kneeling down in the snow looking at the tracks of his son, and he says, "They're Jody's tracks, all right. I'd recognize them anywhere. This snow is a godsend. Wherever those tracks lead, we can follow." And the narration says, "And so it goes, until the frantic searchers top a rise some distance from the town to discover." And then we see the townsfolk, and they're following the foot tracks, and they are leading straight into the mines. And Jason calls to the people behind him saying, "The tracks, they lead down towards the mine. Come on, men, we'll catch up to him soon." And as the men approach the entrance of the mine shaft, Jason continues, "There, do you see? Jody's path. It trails off into the darkness. We've got to follow." But then the mayor chimes in saying, "Jason, no! Don't you realize which tunnel this is? It's Tunnel 13, Jason. We can't follow Jody into there." Then Jason, with torch in hand, walks into the mine and he says, "Maybe you can't, Muttridge, but he's my son. I'm going in there alone if I have to." But before he can finish his sentence, Swamp Thing reaches out and puts his hand on the shoulder of Jason, and Swamp Thing thinks, "No, Jason, you're not going in there." And then Swamp Thing pushes Jason back from the mouth of the tunnel, and as Swamp Thing walks in, he thinks, "I'm going in there, in your place. I owe you that much at least. You just stay here and wait. I'll be back with your son, or I won't be back at all." So Swamp Thing walks into the mine shaft and leaves the people there at the entrance, and as he walks, the narration says, "Determinedly, the hulking man-brute shambles into the tunnel's depths, his moss-hooded eye peering intently ahead, and that is unfortunate, for were he to glance back at the crowd gathered behind him, he might notice a most bizarre expression upon their shadowed faces, a gleaming grin of triumph. But the Swamp Thing does not glance back, and so he lumbers on, following the tracks of a rusty ore cart deep into the clutching darkness, until the tracks abruptly end, and there is nothing for him to follow, save an inner voice that draws him onward into the tunnel's darkest recesses and the rim of an unnatural pit. And we see Swamp Thing approach a rocky edge as the tunnel ends, and we get another creepy panel of that eyeball, and it is open and it is looking at Swamp Thing, and the narration says, "For he has called, and at last he has been answered." And as we turn the page, we get a full-page splash of Swamp Thing standing on the edge of this mine shaft as it opens into a giant cavern, and at the bottom of this cavern, we see a giant blob of a monster made of flesh and muscle and sinew, and tentacle arms are coming off of it and towards Swamp Thing, and the narration of the thing continues. "And having been answered, he is satisfied, most satisfied, for he is Mngala, and he lives. Dear God in heaven, he lives." And then the narration over Swamp Thing says, "And to the nauseated Swamp Thing's mind, he speaks, in a voice that is like a guttural whisper from beyond the grave, like a flesh-curdling hiss out of hell. And we see Swamp Thing's knees look like they're about to buckle, and he's trying to keep his balance as the blob speaks to him, saying, "Welcome, you who were once Dr. Alec Holland. Ningala has been expecting you." And then some tentacles shoot out from Nungala's body, and the blob continues. "Come to me, Dr. Alec Holland. Ningala has need of you." So as one of the tentacles grabs Swamp Thing's foot, he thinks, "What? That unholy obscenity has grabbed hold of my ankles. But if it thinks it will pull me down there, it will have to think again." So Swamp Thing leans backwards, and behind him is the tunnel. And the tunnel has a bunch of wood bracing that are these giant beams that form a square around the tunnel walls and also along the tunnel ceiling. So Swamp Thing grabs hold of these wooden beams, and the narration says, "And as the Swamp Thing wrenches free, the tunnel walls shudder slightly." So Swamp Thing is able to pull himself free of the tentacles, but it seems that came at a cost to the stability of the walls. But Numgala isn't going to give up that fast, so he says to Swamp Thing, "Come, Dr. Holland, do not be foolish. You cannot hope to deny Nungala, for Nungala is eternal, the giver of all things." Then we get some flashback panels of Nungala talking about him being eternal, and we're seeing the dinosaurs, and we're seeing cavemen, and then we're seeing the father of the old man who died at the beginning. And over these panels, Nimgala narrates, "It was Nimgala who decreed the birth of life on your planet. Nimgala who saw the coming of man and bestowed him with the capacity for mindless violence. But Ningala has been generous as well, for he has touched the minds of your greatest scribes, Lovecraft, Bierce, Poe. But Nungala had done all this from a very far place, a place not of your world, and there alone Nungala would have stayed, had not Abraham, father of Ezekiel, grandfather of Jason, spoken the spell that freed Nungala from his distant prison. Nungala came into your world most slowly as a growth on the limb of he who had released Nungala, until at last Nungala consumed him and took Abraham's physical mass as his own." And under that bit of narration, we are seeing Abraham, the father of the old man who died at the beginning, and he's doing the spell that freed Nungala, and then we see his arm become infected with a massive tumor that overtakes his body until there's nothing left except a writhing blob of flesh and tentacles. And Nimgala's narration continues. "But Nungala grew hungry then, hungry for more mass to claim as his own, hungry to drink the minds of those whose mass he claimed. And so Nungala went searching and found more mass to thrive on, more minds to enjoy, large mass, small mass, all the same to Nungala. For Nungala must have much mass to grow to his full size before all the universe reaches prime." And under this narration, we're seeing townsfolk over the years getting sucked into the tunnels by the tentacles, and we're even seeing little animals like rabbits getting pulled in as well. And then under that last bit of narration about the universe, we see all the planets being in alignment in space, and apparently the planets being aligned will help Nungala move to its next evolution. And the narration continues. "For soon, the great geometric progression that has begun at the birth of the cosmos will be finished at last. Soon each intergalactic body will be in position to complete the vast celestial circuitry that will make Nungala the master of all that is,
but only if Nimgala has attained his full mass. And you, Dr. Holland, will finally provide Nimgala with sustenance enough to be fulfilled. So come and make Nimgala whole.
But Swamp Thing ain't having any of that, and he notices that one of the big wooden supports that broke free when he was breaking away from the tentacles is loose. So he walks over to it and he grabs hold of it and he pulls and he thinks,
come and let myself be devoured by a pulsing cancer like you.
And then the support breaks free and Swamp Thing brings it over to the ledge. And this thing is a gigantic post of wood, so definitely could do some damage if it falls from that great height. And Swamp Thing's thoughts continue.
In a word, Nimgala.
And then Swamp Thing actually yells out, no! And then he hurls the giant wooden beam down into the blob that is Nimgala, and it sinks deep into its flesh. And Nimgala replies to Swamp Thing saying,
fool, you dare disrupt Nimgala's mass. Nimgala is enraged.
Then all of a sudden, a rumble starts in the cave, and Swamp Thing looks up as he notices stones falling and smacking him, and he thinks,
huh? Nimgala is pulsating so furiously, he is making the entire cavern crumble, and without the post I threw to help support its ceiling, the tunnel is caving in.
So as the tunnel starts to collapse, mainly the cavern is collapsing first, and we're seeing giant boulders and wooden beams fall into the body mass that is Nimgala, and the narration says, once again the tunnel walls shudder, but this time they do not shudder slightly. This time, those shudders are death throes. Then we cut to the outside of the tunnel where the townsfolk are still waiting at the entrance mouth, and a bunch of dust starts pouring out of the tunnel, and the narration says, and is it the chalky dust blowing from the collapsed tunnel's entrance, or an overwhelming shiver of relief that chokes Jason's words to a whisper? And we see Jason say,
nothing could have survived that. Both monsters are dead. They have to be. At long last, it's over.
But just as he says that, he sees Swamp Thing's hulking body appear in the dust cloud that is coming from the tunnel mouth. And Jason says,
God, no! It's impossible! One of them is still alive!
And Swamp Thing sees Jason and thinks,
no thanks to you, friend.
And then he goes over to Jason and he grabs Jason by the collar, and it looks like Swamp Thing might be about to strike Jason, and Swamp Thing is thinking,
I went into that ghastly black hole on your behalf, on an errand of mercy, I thought. But you filthy scum, you sent me in there as a sacrifice. I ought to.
And terrified, Jason begins to plead for his life, saying, no, please, don't hurt me. We didn't want to do this to you, but that thing inside the mine, it forced us to, controlled us, made us fake Jody's disappearance. Please, we're sorry. Don't hurt me. So Swamp Thing tosses Jason away, and Swamp Thing thinks,
hurt you, Jason? No, I won't hurt you. As you said, it's over.
And then silently, Swamp Thing just walks away into the snow-covered forest. And the narration says, the Swamp Thing turns silently, then shambles off into the woods. And in his solemn mind, the words echo, it's over. But as usual, the words are wrong. It's never over. And we see as Swamp Thing disappears into the woods, Jason begins to rub his arm, and as he does, we get a close-up, and we see it has begun to grow a very large tumor. So it seems that somehow Nimgala has lived. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.